All right, so welcome everybody to the Tribal Water Security Project's monthly webinar series, the first one in 2022. Demarus Tevuk is an Inupiaq researcher, writer, and educator with a background in traditional ecological knowledge, also known as TEK, science and native pollinators. Demarus earned her degree in environmental studies from the University of Washington, where she produced 4 case studies on tribal climate change projects that were funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Region 10 and their grants. Demarus is currently leading a Native neighborhood feasibility study in the city of Seattle and supports developing the webinar series for the Tribal Water Security Project and the Inupiaq Native community. Today, Demarus will share her knowledge to the components of traditional knowledge, specifically on ethics and values, scientific content, and objectives. This presentation will outline a set of traditional sustainable values and how they are taught and reinforced, and how we can bridge TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, and Western science by understanding the cultural frameworks that are present in both systems. I'll be dropping a link here momentarily to that Native neighborhood community study if you would like to also explore more about that, and I'll pass it over to you. Welcome, Demarus.
Thank you. I will share screen. Okay, get this. Oops. Okay, had to get my video set up. Let me move some stuff around so that I can see my screen better. Okay, so thank you for having me. I've given my presentation a lot of times, and I usually have a little more time to go over everything, so I'm going to try to speak quickly. And this is really an introduction to the cultural frameworks that make up Western science and traditional knowledge. And oops. There, okay. So I like to start by introducing myself. My name is Demarus Tevuk. I am Inupiaq. The plural Inupiaq means the real people. I was born in Nome, Alaska, and my childhood really influenced my research because we moved around the country a lot. I've got a little map that shows all the different places that I've lived. So I grew up with a set of traditional values. We had a poster similar to the one that I found. I had a poster up in my home. And then something that I noticed as a child is that even though we lived in really different landscapes, a lot of these values were talked about by local leaders. They were brought up during ceremonies and gatherings. Elders and people would talk about like really similar values to what I grew up with. And when I look back at my childhood in Alaska, I always think that we are practicing sustainability when we're gathering plants, because the plants grow so slowly, soil is built up very slowly. We have to be really careful with how we harvest plants. So I just like to give this background about what really influenced my research. My senior capstone project, I had a research question about what can we learn from Indigenous people about sustainability. So the bulk of my research was looking at traditional, like looking into academic research about traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge. These are all like really similar terms. So it's also called Indigenous knowledge. Some people like to use the term native science, which is something that I like to use. I also conducted interviews. And then a lot of the framework information, it was really influenced by when I attended an American Indian Science and Engineering Society leadership conference when I was like first starting out at college. So just before we get too much into everything, I just like to talk about this first, about how to avoid cultural appropriation. There are some really big differences between Indigenous culture and Western and European cultures. And because we don't have a lot of time today, unfortunately, I have to rely on a lot of generalizations. I wish that we didn't have to do that because it is problematic. And appropriation, it occurs when cultural elements are removed from their context and put into a different cultural context. So the way to avoid appropriation is to keep that original cultural context intact. And that's what I'm talking about today, is what the context is. So the best way to avoid cultural appropriation is to keep the traditional knowledge holders there at every step of the process of the work that you're doing, so that the knowledge holders are there during the research, during like the background, formulating the questions, analyzing your data, implementing what you figured out, like coming up with your plan, and then maintaining the project. Every step of the way needs to have somebody there. If your project is relying on traditional knowledge, you really have to have a knowledge holder there, because they're the ones that have all of that, the context. So one of the things that I did was use, Google has an Ngram tool where you can put in words and it will search through every book that's ever been written. So I use this tool to show the incidence of the word sustainable and sustainability. And this is showing that in the English language, these two terms are relatively new. During the Nixon era, the word sustainability really started to be used because the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA Act had been formed, the agency was formed at that time. That's, according to the government, that's when those terms really started to be used. And then there was a big peak in around 2005 is when every course that I was taking at school was about sustainability. So in English, it's viewed as a new word. And the English definition of sustainability is something, the ability for something, some behavior to be maintained at a certain rate or level. I just like to point out that in this view of sustainability, it's viewed as a noun, but that there's a lot of problems with that because you end up with over 300 definitional forms of sustainability. So you have sustainable economics, sustainable housing, sustainable business. And each of those terms is going to have a different definition of what sustainability means for that behavior. The classes that I took, a lot of the time sustainability was presented as an unknown future state. We've never experienced sustainability before, and so it's this utopia that we want to work towards. There's no clear path for how to get there. It's all, we don't know what it's going to be like, and we don't know how to get there. That's how it was presented to me. A lot of people are used to the triple bottom line definition of sustainability, where you have to think about people, planet, and profit. The problem with this definition is that it's actually really restrictive because it only really is applicable to businesses. And you have to be careful because there's a lot of businesses and organizations that are going to use sustainability as a way to greenwash and to make them present themselves as being sustainable. Really, what they're talking about is really more prosperity and not sustainability. I like to point out that sustainability is actually an ancient concept because all cultures have faced the need to live sustainably. Like, we wouldn't exist here today as humans if our ancestors didn't figure out sustainability at some point. There is evidence of the establishment of Northwest coastal culture structure more than 3,000 years ago. The Tsimshian have sustainably harvested their fisheries for over 9,000 years. The village of Nook, Alaska was formed 4,000 years ago. The only reason why it was there is because geological shifts happened to create the sand spit that the village sat on. So we could go on and find all different kinds of examples of indigenous cultures around the world and other groups around the world that they figured out how to live sustainably in their homelands. So I just like to point out, sustainability is not a new idea. This is something that all of humanity has been struggling, like needing to learn how to figure out how to live sustainably on Earth. What we're going to go over today is all of these things that show the context between these two different knowledge systems. And the knowledge systems, they look like they are very different, but they're actually really good at complementing each other. And I usually, in the past, I would just have 1 or 2 slides showing the context, but today we're going to really go into what the context is for both of the knowledge systems. For Western science, there's some characteristics. Western science claims to be value-free and culture-free. It has a goal of being objective, and there's a real focus on quantitative data. That means data that has numbers attached to it. But I like to point out that nothing exists in the culture-free bubble. Everything that you're doing with scientific work is going to include the cultural framework that you're operating from. And so there are actually a lot of ideas that are presented in the Western scientific realm that are presented as being objective and clinical, but they actually come from a cultural place. And they're presented as scientific fact, but there's actually nothing that's shown that it's been tested. So the first concept we'll talk about is time. In Western science, time is sequential. It's kind of like beads on a string, like one event happens and then the next. So this is why we have sustainability viewed as a new concept. And there tends to be a lot of focus on viewing ideas as being new or innovative, like we've never done this before. Time is also viewed as rigid, and then there's values associated with things that have happened in the past. So some event is significant and it's given a lot of value. There's a lot of effort to talk about that event. But in traditional knowledge, time is viewed as cyclical. And then the time frames are really long also. The cycles can be very long. So this is why traditional knowledge would tend to view sustainability as something that's ancient and it's been around for a while. There tends to be a focus on repeated patterns and returning to lessons. And then past, present, and future, all of the time is interconnected with each other. They're not separated. So space in Western science, space is viewed as linear and static, unchanging. It feels a little weird to try to describe space as like linear. Oh, I don't know if that really makes sense to everybody here, but there is, if you look at biology, nature is viewed, the systems are viewed as, because of the sequential time and linear space, you have primary, secondary, succession. So then there's a real focus on permanence. Like biology is viewed as there's a start and a middle and then an end, and this is the achievement, and this is like the pinnacle of the way the system is going to settle. But in traditional knowledge, space is viewed as spherical and fluid and ever changing. So the River of Life book, I was only able to find excerpts of it, but Michael Marchand, he talks a lot about boom and bust cycles. And then in the book Changes in the Land, Bill Cronin, he's not native, but his work was about looking at the historical environmental changes in New England with the ways that Native people would manage the land. And the theme that came out of that is showing that nature is stable, but when you help introduce changes to the land, that improves food productivity. And then the view of nature is really different. So in Western science, nature is viewed as competitive, restrictive, and then this leads to a desire to control nature because there's this feeling that nature is not providing what we need. There is also a view of separation of humans and nature, and then this focus on calling something pristine if there's no people present. I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes. There is also a tendency to have good and evil valuations attached to different components of nature, like a plant could be viewed as evil or good, animals, places, weather patterns could also be given valuation. And then in traditional knowledge, nature is viewed as cooperative and abundant. And then there tends to be this desire to view, because humans are part of nature, there's a focus on how do we coexist with nature. And then all life and natural forces, they all have a role to play in nature. There's no stack ranking of life. There's no good and bad valuation. And by some Native scholars, there is an acceptance of so-called invasive species. And that's just showing that every creature has a role to play in the world. For data and intuition in Western science, like I said before, there's a focus on quantitative data. And this is data that's specific. It can stand alone on its own. And Western science is great at coming up with ways to find that number, find that data point. The knowledge tends to be really broad, and there's also a tendency to say, let's figure out the way something works no matter where it's placed. So you can take information from one landscape and impose that on a different landscape. And then there's an intellectual focus. So you have to, and that's opposed to the other way to approach knowledge, where in traditional knowledge, there is more of a focus on qualitative data, and that means like, let's describe the health of a system. Let's talk about how something is doing, not the number value that is attached. The knowledge tends to be specific, so that if you can't remove the knowledge from one landscape to another, so you have to say, for this time, for this place, for this family, this is the knowledge that that we can rely on, that we understand for this place in this moment. And then the focus is on an intuition. So that, I think this point of intuition versus intellectual is probably the thing that feels the strangest to talk about a knowledge system that allows you to use intuition as a data point. I'm going to talk a little bit more about intuition later. I like to talk about cynical worldview. I think a lot of people have probably seen this poster or this meme. So in the cynical worldview, humans are apart from nature. We're going to go down a path. When you view humans as apart from nature, that means that every human action that we have, we don't know how to interact with the world. So every human action that we have with nature is inherently wrong because we're separate from nature. Then we end up with, there's no feeling of responsibility for our actions. And then there's a view of nature being unforgiving and cruel. And then conservation and preservation means that you remove humans from the landscape because humans are not part of nature. And then we end up with a lot of pessimism, a lot of feeling that the world is like everything's doomed to fail because we don't know how to, like there's no room for us to make any kind of improvements. I think that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. I just like to point all of this out as something for us to think about. If we have the cynical worldview, where does it come from? And is it scientifically sound? I don't think that it is, because we know that like everyone has, like we are animals. We evolved to be here. That's my belief, is that nature wants humanity to exist. So I also like to talk about the differences in the view of knowledge in Western science. Again, there's a focus on things being analytical. Systems are broken apart into components. And then the knowledge belongs to the individuals or to the institutions that funded the studies. The focus is on information that stands alone as a noun. That's why you end up with a lot of quantitative data. And in the Western knowledge system, logic does not allow contradictions. You have to find one universal truth that can be like removed from where it is and into another landscape. So contradictions are not allowed. In traditional knowledge, the knowledge is holistic. Systems are left whole and intact. the information belongs to the community, but you really have to earn the right to have access to the knowledge. I will explain more why that's like that. And then the focus is on information that informs action. And logic allows contradictions because contradictions are a reflection of the natural world. There's a great paper that talks about that. It's called Exploding Individuals. Actually, I should have provided a link for that earlier. So usually, this book is a great recap of all of the things that I talked about for context, about how in the Native worldview, humans are a key part of nature. Nature is abundant and giving. Nature changes and shifts. Every person has a role to play in the world. Space is spherical and time is cyclical. And then this book, she also talks about the Western worldview of humans being apart from nature, that nature is static and constrained, that your hierarchy, your place in the ladder determines your role, space is linear and time is sequential. The other thing that I like to point out from this book is that she talks about how even though Native people we've had a lot of changes in our culture, like assimilation policies where we speak English. We are placed into Western framework schools. Even though we've had all of these forces to assimilate Native people into Western culture, the worldview remains intact. There's a great essay in here about how our worldview has not changed, even with changes in language and changes in school and stuff. And she's got a great story in this book about explaining how she sees that happening and the proof that she has that the worldview hasn't changed. So now let's talk about the components of traditional knowledge. And this graphic is from Kyle White, and I forget who the other person that helped make this graphic. But it's showing that traditional knowledge is not just the knowledge, like the quantitative data by itself. The knowledge is, there's three tiers or three legs of a stool. There's the knowledge, which is place-based. It's got the whole intact systems. And then the ethics and values, which help guide the practice and the policy. So traditional knowledge really focuses on action. Like you have a question of what to do, and then the knowledge, all of this knowledge together is working together to give you the answer of what action should you take. And so I like to point out, I like to call it our knowledge system is an ethical science. It includes values. Values are central to the knowledge. It's not separated. So we start to think about Indigenous sustainability is about creating abundance in natural resources. It's about having a positive action in nature. Changes in the land is also a good example of having that positive action. The Indigenous ideal of sustainability is a verb, it's an action, because Native science is also defined by action. And who's asking that this book really talks about how traditional knowledge, Native science is in action. So then my thesis is that context is key. Here's another overview of the big differences between Western science and Native science. These are equal and complementary knowledge systems. They are stronger together, but the next step for incorporating both systems is to maintain that context of Native science. So all of the things I talked about before about time, space, view of nature, all of those things have to stay intact. But the best way to do it is to keep a knowledge holder, Native knowledge holder, present in your work. So I came up with a set of sustainable values, but I couldn't just say everything is related to sustainability. So these are the parameters that I created, that the values have to be holistic, they have to be inclusive of everyone's needs, not just human needs, but needs of nature. They have to be traditional, like that bedrock. unchanged, even in the forces of assimilation. They have to be common across North America, because every culture has to figure out how to live sustainably. They're going to come up with similar values, similar things to help guide them, even if the landscapes are really different. The values have to be forward thinking, they have to be proactive, and everybody has to come together in the community to practice the values together. These are the Indigenous sustainable values. And I'm going to go into each one very quickly. It's relationship building, respect, responsibility, reciprocity or sharing, appreciation, and low consumption, accept only what you need. So relationship building is central to Indigenous culture. It's not just building relationships, it's also maintaining them. And the relationships are not just between humans, it's between humans and the natural world. And also the relationships go both ways. So you have a relationship that you feel towards nature, you should also be able to feel the relationship of nature like talking back to you. And the term all my relations is something that helps ground the community, reminds us it's not just like we're all related to each other, but we're also related to the natural world. Respect is another core concept that permeates a lot of Indigenous consciousness, and respect is extended beyond, like between you and your elders. It's also to your community, to your ancestors, and you need to respect nature. And it's the foundation of relationship building. You can't have good relationships if you don't have respect. There's also part of the concept of 7 generations is that you're respecting 7 generations. Responsibility. So a strong sense of responsibility for your actions is infused, like it's taught to children from a young age. And you have obligations to your family members, but also to the natural world. You have a duty to show responsibility. Community leaders are expected to model responsibility through their actions, not just through what they say. And then the responses of the natural world are a reflection of whether or not you've followed through with your duty to be responsible. And reciprocity is the act of giving or sharing gifts from the natural world. So everything that we have is a result of nature giving freely to us: food, clothing, shelter. And so we can give gifts back to nature also. Reciprocity is a part of building relationships, and you're showing thankfulness, you're showing responsibility, and you're showing respect. I like to talk about reciprocal economies. When I look into reciprocal economies, a lot of what's talked about is not from a native framework. So it just, like, what's out there just doesn't really work with what I'm talking about. But the part of the research that I did showed that economic incentives of reciprocity, it encourages responsibility and encourages resource management because it reduces the incentive to harvest too much. So if you operate in a reciprocal economy, you're gonna behave better, like you're gonna take care of the resource in a better way. And the Northwest Coastal Reciprocal Economy, it distributes wealth for the benefit of all of the community. And gifts can be given to each other without requirement of returns. Like you just kind of trust the system. You're gonna give to somebody and somebody's gonna give back to you also, whatever you need. And I like to show this picture of a plate of food. It's my mom. She's using social capital to participate in a reciprocal economy. Some of these things she's gathered and processed on her own, but a lot of it she's had to trade with people. And appreciation, showing appreciation essential to prayer and ceremony, and thankfulness is also practiced during hunting and gathering. Appreciation reinforces all the other values because it's respectful, it's an act of responsibility. It builds on relationships, not just between humans, but between you and nature. And then all of these gifts is viewed as coming from from nature. Like I said, your clothing, your tools, your shelter, it's all a gift from nature. You're gonna feel thankfulness back to nature. And then the last value is low consumption. And this is I like to say it's Indigenous definition of conservation. It's you accept only what you need. And I like this quote, before I leave, I find out who I want to help, who I want to give to, that tells me how much I need, you just feel it. You know when you have enough. You don't shoot animals you have no use for. If you're going to treat nature like that, she's going to come back on you twice as hard. This is a quote from Colin Nelson, Simpson. I like this quote because it kind of like, covers everything that I talked about, that there's a reliance on intuition. There's a view of if you act irresponsibly, nature's gonna show you, nature's gonna teach you how to be responsible, remind you how to be responsible. And it's about, like when you're going out and gathering, you're thinking about not just what do you need, but what do you need to share with your community. Natural law is also another, this quote is also a good way to kind of summarize everything about the values. Natural law is a way of living in the world that is governed by nature and tied to our native language, creation stories, songs, and ceremonies. Natural law teaches us to give reverence, have gratitude, and never waste these resources. The natural law is to take only what is needed and to leave the rest, and to offer thanks to Creator for providing our traditional foods. That's Shelley Vendiola from the Swinomish Climate Change Initiative that was included in this document. Here's really quickly how values are taught and reinforced. They're taught to the younger generation. They're included in some creation stories. Leaders are expected to lead by action, not just talking. There's a lot of social norms for how to teach the worldview and how to reinforce it. And then the values are present in ceremony. That's why we have ceremonies, is to present the values, express them, reinforce them. And a great book for learning more about how values are taught is A Streaming of Sheep in Navajo Country. And so all of these values, here's my definition of sustainability. It's creating abundance and stability in nature for the health of ourselves and our animal and plant relatives. And then when I worked with Sustainable Seattle, I created a definition for them that kind of merged what they had been doing in the past. And then my Indigenous definition is, we define sustainability as the ancient and enduring practice of creating richness in natural resources, attuning to nature's environmental indicators, and providing equitable access to health, food, shelter, and economic wealth for all people. And so here's to recap, the sustainable guidelines are: people are a key part of nature. We follow natural law and live within natural constraints. The guiding ethic is to take care of each other, not just take care of our human, each other humans, but take care of nature and all that nature means. Reciprocal economies reduce the incentive to harvest too much. And also just a reminder that sustainability is ancient, and humans inherently know what sustainability means. We just need to spend a little time finding the answers to what sustainability is. So thank you very much. I know I went over the half hour.
No, that's great. This was wonderful. Thank you.
And I'll stop sharing.
All right, so we'll go ahead and stop the recording so we can transition into our talking circle portion today. Thank you again so much for that informative lecture. I personally feel like